Hello everyone, today we talk about the rural and economical centrality of the seigneurial system. We already discussed the seigneurial system on Schwerpunkt more than once, and we have tried to outline its main characteristics, and today I thought to reframe and to rediscuss this a little bit, also to let's say fix some points that show even on a strictly terminological level sometimes, the levels of approximations that you can make and how this system was really something you can expand its temporal boundaries like. The seigneurial system is a term that you find in different historiographies named in different ways. There is the manorial system, there's the Curtis system. Kind of each European country fundamentally calls it in a different way, so it's not a big deal really, as long as we know we're talking something fundamentally similar or essentially the same actually, and maybe differing on the base of different local characteristics, and in fact the various national historiographies have shaped even the terminology on. But really we're talking about a moment in history in which the real differences here are not really technological, for example. These are pre-industrial societies that mostly do the same things, right? The seigneurial system is something you can find literally everywhere by stretching a little bit the standards. What really impacts, and the way it's so important, especially for European history, is naturally that this is the base for the development of eventually what is called the feudal system, or the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system if you prefer. But let's say also here you realize that there are several concepts and views of even of the Middle Ages that overlap. The real difference really is on the base of wealth distribution at the end of the day, because not being there many other differences, basically what matters here is how much wealth was in the hands of whom, right? And we know that, especially in from Carolingian and during post-Carolingian times especially, there was a greater, a solid centralization, if you want, which is paradoxical, because from a political point of view it was happening the exact opposite, that everything was collapsing and fragmenting hopelessly for eventually took several centuries to fix it. But economically speaking, what you see is as the feudal elite emerging is really being formed through the compactation of this land estates, actually not even properly other forms of wealth, because monetary economy is very asphyctic at this time, under the hands of this aristocracy that actually is very, very composed. The idea even of nobility is taking shape actually from at least the one we intend from feudal times, and very, very progressively. And there is a lot of theoretical social mobility. At least very fewer and fewer people can do that, but at least the ones that manage it can really sensibly increase their power, wealth, and starting these seigneuries that are seigneuries for real. But even in the previous centuries to the Carolingian times, and this is what maybe we add a bit of new today, is that it already existed something similar. I made a video, for example, that is titled, if I'm not wrong, from the Roman villa to the early medieval Curtis, something like that. That stresses, for example, what is already widely known about the similarities existing between those forms of land exploitation, and that sometimes were, in fact, just the continuation of previous ones. And even if you look at feudal society as a whole, you realize that, or a seigneurial society if you prefer, it's because they are two different things. I mean, when we talk about feudality, we can, it depends really on the emphasis that you put on certain characteristics. There are certain, more economically oriented interpretations that look at feudalism, right? Like that thing of concentration of wealth in just this very tiny elite that commands everything. But feudalism can also be interpreted more from an institutional point of view. The strengthening of this hierarchy, this definition, this framing into the new monarchies, that is something that takes more time. So you understand how easy it is to really play on definitions that are really conventional, right? So never, if there's someone who really, is very harassing you for the way you call these things, well, just know that it's not this huge deal as long as you know what you're talking about at the end of the day, and this is valid for whole history in general and all approximations we use. But this system finds, in fact, its basis both in the Germanic world and in the Roman world, right? At the end of the day, these were clientelary societies that had those forms of revenues. The term feud, from which even feudalism comes from, was the name which cattle in the Germanic world was intended in this clientelary for form of reward, of clientelary remuneration, etc. And then in the Roman world was instead a largely sedentary one, the word de latifundia, etc. So there is a mix of these elements in early medieval times in Latin Germanic Europe that makes the seigneurial system taking certain forms, right? And naturally, much of this story has to do, as we will see now, even with the Frankish kingdom, the Frankish Empire, that kind of spreads the Vassalatic-Beneficiary model in its social segmentation and stratification a bit everywhere in continental Europe, and eventually after the 11th century, in countries, think about Anglo-Saxon England, but even beyond, and it doesn't happen really only through conquest, but also through simple imitation, also because the aristocracies of all Europe and beyond actually like this model. They realize it's actually a pretty profitable way to increase power and to justify the rule of the aristocracy and so on. So there is also this kind of very heavy political, cultural factors that press into this direction, aside from other socioeconomical ones that have to be understood. So it's a very complex process. But let's say that because of this, it's also very progressive. It's very gradual, right? It happens different degrees, kind of a bit everywhere. So the most famous example in this sense of seigneurial system is normally the one that spread in this region of what today is northern France, between the Loire and the Seine rivers. That is in the Frankish kingdom, and especially in the area of Neustria, right? This was an area that in let's say now it's difficult to explain a little bit how the thing worked, because the factors are also fairly unknown, but they can be explained. It's a long story, but let's say that on which there is a solid fertile ground, certain Atlantic weather, Atlantic climate, and even a certain particular political and social organization that has seen the development Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, etc., into which the seigneurial system spreads very fast, right? And in which and where basically spreads pretty much all over the rest of the Carolingian Empire, always given that it naturally took sometimes even centuries, and even it happened far beyond the end of the Carolingian times, in this broader export, let's say Frankish export of the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system. These are not systems you can easily replicate elsewhere, because if anything, there is no wealth there. Many regions out the outskirts of the Carolingian world are very different from northern France. Like take Germany, where, for example, there is a very the environment is very, very different. It's much wilder territory. The wealth is much less and scattered, and it's difficult to invest into this area and to make things fruit. Think about Italy, where it's a solidly wealthy area, but where also wealth is much more equally distributed than in northern France. So even there feudalism spreads, but you know that there are also more cities, and everything gets kind of more complicated in some ways. So but it's interesting, for example, that after the Loire and the Seine, the area between the Loire and the Seine rivers, it's actually northern Italy and Lombardy especially where the seigneurial system spreads the fastest, partly also because of the agricultural resources of the area, but also for a certain ability of investing, in fact, in those activities into a broader economical system that also takes a lot into account international trade, this higher monetary economy than and these are differences at the end of the day. I made a video about this actually, which I don't really recall I don't remember the title, but I mean, at least if you're a regular follower, maybe you remember it, in which we go a bit more in detail to that into that difference between this duo, but we're not talking about that today. So it's naturally let's say the Frankish model, if we can look at it as this mold and the referential model, but it's not really a referential model proper, right? The Franks basically export together with feudalism this effort of social certification, but locally this results in different ways, right? So we can approximate very largely that this system spreads a little bit, at least within Western Europe. At the end of the day, let's say up to a certain point, eventually, I mean, feudalism. This is a formula that goes along with feudalism in general. So wherever you see feudalism, at a certain point, that Western Europe represents a model, and even a spin-off for all these other surrounding areas that get feudalized, right? In turn, and you can see this in Northern Europe, you can see this in certain areas of Southern Europe, even that had known very centralized models. Take, I don't know, when the Byzantine Empire is conquered by the Crusaders, well, theoretically feudalism is exported there. It doesn't work very much, or at least it creates problems. But also that the same Byzantine Empire, even before falling to the Crusaders, was substantially heading towards this more kind of Western-like direction. Take the Empire of Manuel I, Comnenus, for example, and the same goes in part for the Eastern European monarchies and so on. So this is a model that, in several ways, it's really functional to that type of pre-industrial society, right? The idea that there is an elite, that there is of landowners, is something you can find basically everywhere. These are clienteling societies that work more or less like that. Land is the base of economy. Throughout all the Middle Ages and beyond until the Industrial Revolution, actually, monetary economy is not able to go beyond. I mean, it develops and becomes complementary, but at the end of the day, even towards the end of the Middle Ages, there is especially with the great financial crisis of the 14th century, there is coming back on the land. So this is the way it had to go, given those bases, right? Or at least there is nothing particularly surprising about this. What really makes this different in Europe compared to other areas is also fairly different to explain, because once again, here the way you higher and lower the standards can make things match or mismatch. But let's say that in Europe, this is a process that is really pervasive of all society and policy, right? I made a video on the birth of the rise, I don't remember, of the feudal monarchies, right? That explains exactly this, is that there is not a centralized state emerging from this, but basically a great, a set of great feudal monarchies that basically evolved from the same system, like, the bigger one that emerged came to rule over others, right? And there is actually a persistency of an idea of public, that partly even reinforces this process. We have observed that at this point I can't simply tell you, if you go to medieval society playlist, you'll find plenty of videos that talk about this stuff, so I don't talk about it now. But let's say it's a private model. This is perhaps the most important thing to observe, that Latin Germanic Europe in this phase is something very different from, I don't know, the Caliphate of Cordoba or the Byzantine Empire or the Mesopotamian Caliphate of other lands. It's very different from Northern Europe or Eastern Europe. It's something that is developing as a big fluid machine that, in spite of messing up things in terms of centralization, because it decentralizes a lot, but at the same time makes this systems stick together. This is kind of incredible. It's like a great glue within which lots of pretty tumultuous things happen, but still it's a sort of compact block that also has this expansive capability that is freaking impressive. A few weeks ago we were giving a quantitative dimension on the expansion of medieval European demographic growth, a quantitative dimension, and you can see that, for example, that is framed into this broader seigneurial system at the end of the day. There are certain interpretations now are legitimately out of date and nobody actually buys them anymore, historiographically speaking, that considered but this is something as old as Pirene, just to make you understand what I'm talking about. It's in which basically the rise of cities was, the big thing that saved Europe from darkness and all this. That's absolutely false. Actually, the development of low medieval urbanism is deeply rooted into the development of seigneurial economy. The myth that this was a closed economy, that it worked prevalently on barter, that it was a short-range economy, is just a myth now that's been surpassed by it's not accepted anymore academically because it simply doesn't hold, right? This is a system that actually put in motion a lot of transcontinental trade, and that allowed those same urban centers to grow at the end of the day. And the great revival of medieval Europe, of high medieval Europe, starts from this, and it couldn't be otherwise, right? As long as this system is in fact working on its own, you have to look at chiefly about land property, right? With modern age, there is the new equation that is colonialism, for which a lot of wealth is actually drawn from elsewhere. When we look at medieval times, and that has to be put into account even for pre-industrial times to understand a very important factor how those economies were developing. But in medieval times, this is all internal and it's all land-based, and so medieval civilization is something that is born out of this system, right? And I personally agree with this. I mean, I don't consider the seigneurial system to have been any kind of a regressive thing. I actually think it was, let's say that even the problem of privatization. I mean, this, especially in post-Carolingian times, in this dramatic crisis of public authority and decentralization is something that actually existed already before, and that the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system that the Franks started, at least in this most developed and better shaped way, is couldn't but end up into something like this, given what existed before. But it's particularly interesting to look at the seigneurial system because it's under its development that large areas of Europe that throughout, I mean, since the ancient times were actually the most depressed, and and some of the ones that didn't produce much and were considered only peripheral to European economy, at this point expand. And they do expand a lot, especially in Central Europe, and from this it will eventually spread even towards the north and the east, right? So, and then while the south maintains this kind of more monetary character, even sea trade, of course, and it's still, however, even Southern Europe based on this system. So it's amazing, actually. And if you look at medieval civilization, well, everything kind of starts from there. Like, it goes on. I mean, obviously, I'm not saying that there wasn't nothing before at all. Obviously, the ancient world had its own legacy, etc. But what we call medieval civilization, and its resilience, its ability to even compartmentalize, to invest, to have this kind of more strictly entrepreneurial mindset, paradoxically starts not from the urban classes, but it's transferred. Let's say in there, it's developed at its extremes, right? But the great masses of wealth are generated by the seigneurial system. And if you're interested into this, I also made this other video called "The Resilience of Medieval Civilization" that deals with, in fact, with the characters that allowed medieval civilization to evolve, and not to, contract and basically, stagnate and best into early medieval times and finish in some ways, so that you can't fully recognize it anymore, at least by certain standards. So medieval civilization went on. There was no traumatic crisis of medieval civilization in its evolution. There was the Black Death, there was the Great Financial Crisis, whatever it was caused by, at a broader level, whether maybe it was environmentally or just political and social. We don't actually know in the quantities. Nobody knows, actually, and we cannot know it on the basis of what we have as an evidence. But that system existed. It went on. It kind of transformed itself, but it didn't give up. It didn't crumble in itself. It went on. And that was essentially feudal Europe, right? Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. So, talking about the villa or curtis, that is, by the way, a term you can find used like in contemporarily, right? The villa remains in Latin, this word that is used to define even the manners, the etc. You find curtis as well and other terms, actually, but it's not really important. Every country had its own kind of preferential terms, but also medieval Latin didn't have quite this, just like Latin itself, not this enormous series of varieties. So it's the concept that matters. And what is this really? In order to, we could approximate the definition to a great center of residence and production at the same time. So the villa or curtis is at the same time a farm, an agrarian business, laboratory, an area of residence of the dominus, of lord, seigneur, from which seigneurial, from seigneur, lived, and not just of him, but also many other people, his serfs, right? And that is basically those peasants that, albeit, and this is also another approximation. When you say serf, is you're thinking about the juridically unfree or half free, right? At this time, by the way, slavery still existed practically. It's just that it's difficult to frame even these names, because sometimes it's difficult to frame in contexts like this, really, the difference between a serf and a slave, right? Like in all history, actually. It really depends not just on juridical basis, but what the forms of exploitation were. There were serfs during the seigneurial system that were better off, they were wealthier even individually than freemen. And this is why we tend to call what eventually the peasantry or the feudal Europe kind of serfs, right? Because it gives you the idea that they were really kind of at a lower level. But in theory and in practice, actually, most of these peasants, at least in the beginning, were juridically and therefore theoretically freemen, right? So we have discussed how the seigneurial system really developed, and we have seen that many times it wasn't even a matter of an evil guy with its armed retinue arriving into a village and starting to to bully the peasantry and ruling over them and with the iron fist. And so many times, I can't tell you most of the times, because also in here we can't really read this, and it probably doesn't even make sense to distinguish the thing. It was really especially in those times of absence of public powers, or at least of ineffectiveness, the local communities sought the protection of these lords, right? And these lords were not foreigners. They were people who, they were local aristocracy fundamentally, that took the opportunity of the collapse of the central authority to take over locally, and sometimes they were even legitimized by the king, meaning that these are complicated political games, but it's obvious that part of the reasons even why public authority was maintained is that it was a legitimizing force. But it's not just this kind of tricky sneaky thing. It's also about really that you need some sort of organization at a broader level. There are basically all post-Carolingian kingdoms react, for example, to the second invasions at a monarchical level. Like, there are royal armies, that is to say, at this point the army is collected from this series of vassals that were at one point agreeing on the necessity of responding, militarily speaking, to external threat. But it was a very that was an emergential nature, as you understand, so pretty exceptional one. And for the rest, the system didn't quite work at the monarchical level. It was from this basis, right, that the thing started. Naturally, now we can't talk about the origins of the seigneurial system, but you understand that Carolingian Vassalatic-Beneficiary system had spread with this idea that of the centralized power, for which the local count, it was essentially a knight, or whatever you want to call it, but this mounted warrior, professional warrior, by the way. It was entrusted land locally by the king in order to serve him militarily speaking. So it was a prepaid service, right? And this had to respond. And naturally, when the Carolingian Empire starts to tear itself apart, that I'm deeply convinced really started really from the within, and really the second invasions were just more of a consequence than a cause of the crumbling of the Carolingian Empire. And this should be quite known, because it's really a bit like the Roman Empire, even if the context is very different and also the characteristics of the empires are very different, but how it really happened, right? And therefore there was a push from the lower levels of this vassalatic hierarchy that were pushing for this autonomization and for the strengthening of this local power. And we know of abuses of oppression, like the peasantry, that at this point, by the 9th century, let's say, were still relatively, they were freemen, right? Frankish society was very, very stratified already at this point, but let's say that there were certain local traditions that, local customs that made people free. Well, they appealed to the king, because they said, what are these guys here doing? These are your men, theoretically, and they're not, because they're just like private people that have obtained this concession from the king to make the army work, but at the end of the day, they do whatever they want. We have talked a lot about this. I don't even know at this point how many other videos I can advise you to watch if you're interested, but it's all this very complicated thing, and never buy in those interpretations that say this process is stamped because I already said, because Europe was invaded, right? There is this obsession today for which everything from, in fact, it's say the encapsulation, crusades, it's all because Europe was aggressed. No, it's not really that. It's way more complicated. Historiography has clarified it pretty convincingly at so many levels at this point that it's kind of insane to talk forward. Also because Europe showed paradoxically that they had the measure to respond to those threats, and they didn't, because apparently they weren't what they were mostly interested in to do. But these are complicated things. They're still part of the equation, right? Because the development of the seigneurial system also corresponds to the spread of encapsulation, right? And it was partly triggered by invasions, no doubt, but most of the times it was really the domination strategies of the local lords in order to expand their power of more more communities, more fertile ground, soil, etc., and battling chiefly against each other. At this point, Europeans are fighting a lot against each other and having and for reasons that are actually very logical. I mean, I hate sometimes how medieval history is so ideologically intended, for which everything has to be meant as if Europe had a kind of a perception of itself at this point. It didn't quite exist. It's something more like it, of Europe proper, and especially also kind of Western Europe. Something starts developing from the last centuries of the Middle Ages, and it was loaded with new meaning only during the early modern age and developed further. So here it's not a monolithic system in which you can say, oh well, it's just this guy versus this guy. It's a whole freaking mess, about which also we know relatively few, in the sense that if you take the 13th century, we know plenty of stuff about the various feudal clashes among these aristocrats that were competing for the top, etc. In here, we have few information, but the few we have are pretty eloquent about how the system was hopelessly fragmented essentially for the interests of these aristocracies that paradoxically were doing this in order to rebuild something larger, but on this private basis now, not on the power of the king, that theoretically was a public figure both in the Germanic world and in the Roman world, but especially on the base of their own lineage in this time. And that's also how, given that there were lots of these vassals doing essentially the same thing, that's where medieval knighthood and the concept of feudal nobility really starts emerging from. Because at the end of the day, this was a big competition between the aristocrats, but at the same time, the political and social changes that were triggered by their clash were dramatically impoverishing the rest of society and making them raising above the level and starting to think of themselves as a sort of class on their own, right? And the aristocracy, and that's how it was born. Because otherwise, before, you can't say that there weren't aristocrats, or not even the concept of nobility, but there were lots more freemen that actually didn't like at all the stuff. So it's still pre-seigneurial society, is still aristocratic society, still clienteling society, but the social stratification is much less. So it was more difficult for someone to reach the top and ruling everybody else, which instead is happening at this time. So these are really dramatic times, and they make you understand better, they motivate better why this change already also occurred. The idea of entrusting your own part of your freedom, at least to a lord, it was actually voluntary in great part at this point, because it was better to be protected and losing some of your freedom than not being protected and losing your life, which could happen very, very easily. But also this process was very, very gradual. Like, it's very marked if you come from the before and you're focused on medieval levels, but still it's something that took a lot of time. And as we were saying at the beginning, the seigneurial system didn't quite spread homogeneously everywhere, right? This was mostly a Frankish thing, that is, and mostly an Austrian thing, so a Western Frankish thing at this point. So that even in today's France, things were very, very different from areas like, the north, from the southwest, or etc. So this has to be taken into consideration. And so all these people renounce to their full freedom to become contractually, and these were free contracts, right, to cede part of their freedom to the lords, right? Just imagine you live in a world where, let's assume from a moment to another, our states failed for some reason, and the state cannot, the military basically starts going on its own. The police basically doesn't exist anymore. What do you do to protect your family and to make a living? Well, you probably go to whoever owns power locally, and you try to fit in. And this is dramatic because that person fights with others, so the compete. So the whole society actually was depending on this. It wasn't a passive, a passive dynamic for which the aristocrats did whatever they could and got away with that. They wished they could in the 9th century, in the 10th century, to do something like that. It turns out medieval peasantry up to the late Middle Ages was actually a force to be reckoned with. It is true. I mean, it was obviously still at the bottom social ladder. They were fundamentally, disarmed, and from a certain point onwards, especially this one. But we're talking even in terms of coercive means. If the countryside rebels, it doesn't just take to have a coat of mail and a sword as a nobleman to deal with these things. Peasant revolts are freaking terrible. And also we should abandon this idea of the peasants as the poor people oppressed there, were so pure and wouldn't touch anyone. The peasant communities were some of the most radically violent, aggressive, and destructive, and martyrs that have ever existed, ever. And this is partly explained also by the fact that they were actually oppressed, and they were actually vexated and exploited, and this causes reactions, right? Never think that the peasantry didn't have a didn't have a perception of its own subjugation, right? That they lived definitely in a world in which they probably felt to be framed. Like we don't know what a medieval peasant of the 10th century or the 11th century really thought, because we don't know. They didn't write. We don't have the sources, right? And most of what was written by the elites that loathed these guys and described them as half animals, right? So we don't really know. And they probably, I mean, looking at more modern times where, the peasantry was oppressed in similar ways up to, I don't know, think about, Tsarist Russia in the 20th century, that's very similar to what medieval times could be. I mean, approximately at least. So there is also a lot of literature, take Tolstoy, that shows that the peasantry was so used to the idea to have a master of some kind that they couldn't even understand the idea of freedom fully. But reducing this to a total oppression in which they were just passive, it's wrong. There was always a very sound cooperation necessary between the masters and the peasantry, because they were on the same train, right? If the seigneury failed, the local peasantry probably would have not fared particularly well, especially if they had been supporting that seigneury. And so it's difficult for us who live in a world in which we have all equal rights, and we live in a fundamentally free society, to think of ourselves first of all under someone else. But up to a few centuries ago, it was basically like this everywhere, and that's how even certain identities were spread, right? For us, we value, for example, nationalities as a form of sound identity perception, but in feudal times it was more about under which lord you were than to which country or you belonged, or which language you spoke. Also because people didn't, the majority of people just didn't didn't care very much about the rest of the world in this sense. So even if they were directly influenced sometimes through this, because the aristocracies under which they were, for example, were becoming kind of international. Like, if you take this time in post-Carolingian Europe, you realize post-Carolingian aristocracies intermarried not just locally, but sometimes from kingdom to another. So it's pretty interesting overall how, you know, these contacts at an elite level were extended in terms of range. But to get back on the point, this dependency, let's say, and eventual subjugation of the peasantry brought naturally these communities to work under the Lord, right, for and under the Lord, and they and these people lived fundamentally in this area around it, usually the Lord's residence, the manor, you know, that's where the curtes, for example, and they inhabited sometimes into you know, they had naturally a house with some land plots, but there were many other buildings that were instrumental to the local, you know, to the local economy and production, etc. Like naturally, besides the housing, but also warehouses, for example, or stables, or and you can't imagine. There are many other types, and the seigneuries could be could really vary a lot, also in size. You know, remember that the seigneury here is just like, it's a name that defines the form of relation that is established between the Lord and the communities. It's not really a category as such. So it's as if the king, aside from its public nominal and often theoretical powers, was the biggest lord, right, and it had its own clientele. So that's how it worked, and that's how same public authority gets reshaped from a private background. But the seigneury could be of very different dimensions, right? And it's interesting because the nobility was formed at this point through, well, I don't know, I'm sure whether to open this parenthesis or not, but let's say who were the nobles at the end of the day, right? Because in Carolingian times, for example, as we were saying before, Frankish society was very, very stratified already. Especially the Neustrian society was solidly stratified because it was a legacy of Roman times to which the Frankish aristocracy deeply, you know, adapted to. They intermarried with Gallo-Romans, etc. That had already very powerful clienteles, especially in the bishops. The St. Carolingian dynasty emerges from the Arnulf of Metz. It was the bishop of Metz, and his daughter married the Pippin, the second, if I'm not wrong, of Herstal, or the first, I don't know, maybe the first, actually. I'm confused now, but whatever. You understand how it happened. But this was a form of aristocracy, naturally at the local level, especially before the Carolingians put everything together from the collapse of the Merovingian kingdom, were ruling locally. So you understand that these ways of, even of relation with the local communities, land exploitation, were already there, great part. So the new, let's say, nobility that is not really such. It emerges from the this Merovingian Frankish administration for which the Franks had their own Comitatus, these counts that basically were they put at the head of these local districts that usually had diocese size. They were based even in here, usually around certain centers, and had also a ecclesiastical equivalent in there in the form of the bishop, right? You know, siding with the secular, with the layman, lay authority. And these were not properly noblemen, because Germanic society, you know, I don't think it had really formulated, you know, it hadn't formulated the form of feudal nobility that would spread later. As we were saying, the critical moment was the 10th century, where really this aristocracy self-defined itself, recognized itself, its own noble identity. But before this were kind of more seen, at least perceived from the king as administrators of those lands. Right, these are things that started since the time of Clovis, where the Franks seized Gaul, and they partly imitated even the local Roman administration and shared it with the pre-existing aristocracies. So theoretically, that these counts came to be part, in fact, of what we call the feudal hierarchy at the end of the day, because that was kind of the basic noblemen. Then there were bigger guys like the marquises, the marquions, actually, or the dukes, etc. And then the kings and the emperor when he was elected. So this would more easily identifiable from this perspective as aristocracy. But there were lots of aristocrats that actually came from whoever, doesn't matter what he was. There were people who maybe had been, I don't know, serfs that were freed, emancipated, they made a freaking lot of money with trade activities, and they became so powerful. Think about Samos in Moravia, for example. Well, that was just a Frankish merchant. He was able to unite at a kind of at a princely level all those lands with this marriage ties and clienterly relations. So everything was possible as long as you were wealthy enough. So that's why even the concept of nobility emerging is very relative, right? And especially in these areas like where economy was more monetary and generally people were a bit more equally wealthy than in northern France. They were less but more equally wealthy on average. Like in Italy, for example, you understand that this nobility would emerge spontaneously from even just entrepreneurs, people who had no previous relation with this comital families that maybe, however, would get eventually the comital title from the kings. That is pretty fascinating, and other ways, and this could happen. It was the same serfs of the lord, as we've seen very frequently, actually, that could even be raised by the same lord in this positions of rule, of prestige. And it's very fascinating, because it turns out that this non-freeman sometimes came to be as wealthy, if not more wealthy than the freeman. And this is particularly frequent simply because those people who lived with the lord were in fact like the private serfs at the beginning, right? While the peasantry that lived outside the manor, maybe still within the seigneury, of course, but still freemen juridically, impoverished much more quickly, while the familiar guy in the lord's retinue could make a substantial career, right? So these are interesting times where you can't explain with a simple dichotomy. Oh well, only the rich guys at the top and the rest is still kind of frozen, like they couldn't move. Really, everything was way more complicated. And this would go on for a lot of time, actually, because eventually Europe keeps expanding. So these occasions of mobility, both physical and social, were present. You could really change a lot. So and that's why this was such a unifying factor in spite of all, because this system kind of spoke the same language of relations. So it blended in. The Carolingian Empire fell, but this idea that there was a common, common culture in some way, a common script, etc., was not perceived really in a identitary fashion, in kind of the national level, but there were these channels that fueled the growth of Europe, that had been that were working chiefly on the base of the seigneurial system. So at the end of the day, this meant that the various lordships could be a very, very different size. The actual extension of land owned by the lords could stretch from a few tenths to a few tens of thousands of hectares, right? There are certain seigneuries that become extremely powerful, even more than the king in itself. This is particularly evident in France, where this system is more developed than in any other part of Europe. There are certain counts and dukes that are way more powerful than the king, that at this point, by the way, is still struggling. That the French monarchy is something that basically defined itself. It could be aborted very easily, actually, up to the end of the 10th century, just like the Burgundian one, right? Everything had still to be defined. Actually, Burgundian monarchy at the beginning seemed more promising than the Western Frankish one. At the end of the day, it went into the other direction. But just to tell you how dynamic and competitive the system was, but as competitive as it was, well, that produced civilization. That's the cool thing. That struggle and clash and competition are pretty harsh things in which people can lose very much. But at the same time, civilization does pass through these processes, and it's very hard because obviously that claims victims at the end of the day. But this is the price of civilization many times, and we do pass all through that, because at least as Westerners, the idea that something was, eventually, if it didn't stem from there, it was absorbed by the system, right? It's what we were saying before. At the end of the Middle Ages, this system has expanded itself, as being replicated, as being tested, and it was at the base of the Ancien Regime, right? And in turn, the Ancien Regime, as demonized as it was also the one that generated eventually the emergence of the bourgeoisie, our democratic principles, etc. But there is a lot of continuity that is very difficult to explain, especially to who considers the Middle Ages as a sort of oppressive dark hole where nothing happened and everything was so flat. Well, the seigneurial system is probably the best example of the fact that this is absolutely not true. And I'm being really I don't know what you think about it, but the idea that the Middle Ages is a flat thing, it's something that I've found astonishingly and surprisingly often said around, especially in recent times, because everybody is so focused on, it's easy to put things in relation and to take different standards, but you have always to value on the standards of the time to understand how these things were valuable. And they were, because the seigneurial system invested a lot in production at the end of the day. This was an incredibly, this was a redistributive system. Also, the class system meant that, the lord was just a fat, disgustingly rich guy seated on top of money, with peasants breaking their backs and dying under, while he was, chewing a chicken bone and all this stuff. It's and just collecting money is anti-historical. All the seigneurial wealth was practically reinvested, and this was the only possible way for the seigneury to survive in the first place. Because you have to invest in military retinues, you have to invest in the means of production, you have to ensure that the community doesn't starve to death. The idea that the peasant would starve to death and that the lord wouldn't care is pretty realistic, because that would make the lord's economy crumble, right? As labor force is fundamental at this time, and it's not that there were many people in Europe at that time. So these really were very important factors. So around the seigneurial residence, you can find this group of buildings that were particularly important for local life. Take the stables, the mills, the oil presses, the haylofts, the wells, the church, right? And within the court, so within the with Moat-and-Bailey, fundamentally, you see in the pictures, were produced all those manufacts that were necessary for making the system work. So textiles, tools, instruments, and then working tools and flatware, weapons, and these things costed a lot. I mean, even just an armor. In order to produce an armor or a sword, you had to have tens of farms really working very hard for a long time. This was a very poor world. It was, the surplus. It was barely perceived in terms of at the end of a peasant's life. The idea that you had sensibly improved your life was very 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 poor. It's not about the harshness of this particular system. It's the harshness of that world in the first place. Technology was what it was. There were no means to exploit other energies that wouldn't consume more energies than that. That's the same reason why there couldn't be an industrial revolution in the Roman Empire, which people presume it was possible just because they think that it takes to discover a technology to be able to apply it, economically speaking. It doesn't work like that, and yet we have to fall again and again and again this time. These guys made their best, and if we were projecting in their own times, we would starve to death, and they would come to help us, to make us survive, because we wouldn't be able to know that. So this is very fascinating, because it was a barely more than a survival rate economy, and everything had to be constantly reinvested if you wanted to go on, and that was not enough, because there could be famines, there could be devastations, and so or I don't know, natural disasters as always. So this was a fairly fragile system, but paradoxically it's the seigneurial system that gives it more strength, because this is directed from the top by people who were at this point specializing in saving the system. The political fragmentation probably helped. I mean, part of the reason why the medieval society was so resilient is that, differently from big empires that have a sort of kind of mono direction, that commit all the resources of all the land at once. Here you have basically the whole Europe dominated at each local level by a local lord that is thinking how to improve all the local resources that they have. So this is a system that saves and that burns much less work and wealth than what a much larger system would do. And this helps also to sectorize, to reinvest and to maybe save capitals, and this is what the system at the end of the day makes economy develop at a transcontinental level, and that's where you have cities, and where you have the Renaissance at the end of the Middle Ages. It had started, in fact, from this, right? It took a long time, but it was paradoxically you can say the best system, because we don't know what would have happened if let's assume that feudalism didn't develop. But I would say that there is a social tendency to develop in clienteles, and these clienteles also tend to compete and to knock each other out and to absorb the other people's wealth, and therefore this progressive stratification usually helps. Then obviously this causes a spin-off that, as we see, with the commoners that start developing as well in different separated, let's say in their own communities with different activities, with their own power on their own in the High Middle Ages. But it's still from this base that everything starts, right? Excuse me, I drink a little once again. So the court was also a fortified center, as you understand. So it's the place where theoretically all the community had to take shelter during the invasion. But even thinking of the single Moat-and-Bailey is kind of reductive. Of course, it's not Moat-and-Bailey's popped out every 10 meters, but you can imagine this seigneuries being very developed, very composite, right? Never think the seigneury is this, in all manuals you find the little scheme, the little drawing where you see the castle in the middle and all around the stuff, and that's the tiny little seigneury, right? Yeah, maybe just if it's very tiny, it's something similar to that. Aside from the geography of the thing, it can really change a lot. But most of the seigneuries were something way more complicated. There were definitely several more than one Moat-and-Bailey controlled. There was no territorial continuity, right? Especially in the most in the most monetarily active countries, you find that even during the time of second invasions, that these castles or moats were built actually to be sold. You may say, well, why? I thought that it was all about everybody fleeing within this fortifications because, I don't know, the Saracens or the Normans or the Hungars were arriving. Well, yes, it happened that too. There were people who made money simply building the stuff and selling them to someone else. Because this was a way to make money in a situation that eventually was a bit less dramatic from strictly economical point of view than what is usually pictured. And it turns out, in fact, that encapsulation tends to develop actually after the invasions, not during the invasions. The castles that are built during the invasions usually are in kind of different places from the ones they would usually be built. The place where this stuff was built was really in the center of the countryside, so in very open ground. That is not the best to defend, but it's the best to control over this territory. So that tells you a lot about the relation between actual second invasions and encapsulation. It's that definitely have something and a lot in common, but their relation is way more complicated. So, and in the process, you understand that, for example, the production of food and their preparation and the alimentary reserves and the transformation of the raw materials into worked products were a vital part of these economies, right? The importance of reserves in seigneurial economy, I made a video about that. It's very, very important because it's also a mean of control. Usually these depots are within the court, within the seigneurial residence, so that is a pretty, way of controlling the peasantry, because if there is a famine and there are no reserves, but in the lord's hands, naturally the lord has a very high bargaining power, but at the same time he can't make the peasants die, if they don't accept, that they're. So there is a process of negotiation, right? Negotiation that is particularly important in this process. But it's interesting even to look at the these products, with how in the various areas of Europe think about the importance of not just of grain that naturally was the base in the production, but the seigneurial system does change diet in part, right? And especially the peasantry seems to have been eating way less fats and proteins after the development of feudalism than it did before, where people were kind of freer and they usually relied a bit more on hunting and on gathering or fishing and something like that. Then working in this specialized cultivations that the lords needed because they wanted to fit in this broader international trade of goods that were now a bit above the primary ones, the necessary ones, which witnesses a progressive development of economy. Take grapes transformed into wine, the same grains actually turn into flour, cattle butchered and their meat preserved under salt or smoked and so on. So food that naturally was precious and largely actually served to feed the local population, but that could also be sold. And this system was, as we were saying, pretty more dynamic than is usually believed. Communications are, generally speaking, not. We've talked about long-range trade and exchange, but still, communications were not excessively easy, right? It was full of brigands. The communication net was not all this great much. There is a moment of commercial recession, especially during the second invasions, in some contexts. But this can also be relatively challenged. It depends on where and when, really. And most of the times, these populations traded extensively, even with the so-called invaders. Especially take the Normans or the Saracens that were controlling the seas in the north and the south of Europe, respectively. There was a lot of cooperation as well. The Hungars were a bit wilder. They just, they had different. But even in that case, I'm sure there was this form of contact. But money was rare. For example, usually the alloy was pretty bad, and money was just was very rare to find, let's say, and so that's why, in part, the seigneurial system was depicted for a long time as a chiefly closed and autarchic system, but it's extremely reductive at best, considered like this. Of course, it lacked in potential, but that's where you have to focus. You don't have to reason on the outcome. You have to reason, first of all, on the context, and realizing that actually this system helped to shape into these dear straits, actually, a system that was able to produce again. And Europe restarts from this, and it restarts pretty damn fast for medieval standards. And this is the cool thing about it. So, from the strict point of view of land exploitation, the Curtis, as it's widely known, I believe everybody has studied this from history, from school books, was divided into these two areas: the Pars Dominica, which means in Latin the part of the Lord, of the Dominus, that is also known as the reserve in some contexts, and this is managed directly by the Lord, right? So it's like the Lord's manor, right, in possession. And then you have the Pars Massarica, right? In Latin, this part of the Mansi. The Mansi is this unit more than else than of land plots, right? And the mansus in itself, mansus is singular, mans is plural in Latin, and there were some standards in the measures, especially of the land, that, as we've seen, what was the soundest asset at this point, as money also didn't quite circulate. But the dimension of the single mansus could really vary a lot depending on the area and where. But still, it's the idea. What is important about this is that it's the land plot idea around which the whole system gravitated. It gives even the name to this physical part, more or less physical part of the seigneury, territorially speaking, right? And this area instead was managed by the peasants of free or servile juridical state, this was mostly a productive area. I mean, even the Pars Dominica actually was proper, but let's say that the Pars Dominica tended to be a bit more functional to the Lord's lifestyle in some ways, but not just in terms of consumption, but also in terms of land control, etc. And it was different. But the peasants were mostly in the Muncie were mostly dedicated to this specialized production, right? And the Pars Dominica could also vary pretty much in size. It really depends, as you understand, on every possible factor, the type of cultivation, the height above the sea level. It really changes a lot in terms of what you can cultivate or not, etc. In fact, the same forms of the same contractual modes of land exploitation from the latitude, like there are big differences between the north and the south of Europe in terms of weather, of climate, and this has a great impact. I mean that it's obvious that cold doesn't quite help for technology of the time to grow, but this is also what is amazing about the seigneurial system is that during this time, Northern Europe, albeit still lagging behind Southern Europe, is expanding proportionally faster than Southern Europe, even in areas that had been fairly not excessively productive. If you think about it, even northern France, where the system started from, compared to southern France, for example, had been, at least since from late Roman times, generally poorer, right? I mean, complexively. So this makes you understand that actually, in the absence of real technological improvement that actually didn't happen at this time, or was virtually influenced into this process, it's the type of land exploitation that in turn reflects a different political and social system that is capable of producing more. Now, this is very important as an economical lesson, a lesson of civilization, right? And differences between different areas of Europe are evident. Every region, every culture has its own characteristics, types of animals and of products. If you were to trace this line, Northern Europe is the realm of beer, for example, and Southern Europe is the realm of wine. There are sensible exceptions. Actually, beer was produced even in areas of the south, wine in parts of the north, but even olive oil in the south or butter in the north. So these are differences that matter, and that actually also change other products. I mean, think about how this influences, I don't know, even the soil does influence a lot what the cattle produces. Take French cheese that is kind of famous, French or Italian cheese, for example. French cheese is much fatter. Italian cheese is usually much drier. So this corresponds to this different environmental characteristics. But in any case, all these areas of Europe are kind of struggling together, and they function in relatively similar ways. This is what really matters here. Is that there is a lot in common, in spite of the differences, and great part of this passes through the seigneurial system, right? Carolingian Europe does leave a mark. I mean, if you take France, Benelux, Germany, central and northern Italy, certain areas of northeastern Spain, certain Danubian areas, they do have the similar development because of this system was enhanced by Carolingian domination at the time, and then after the disgregation of Carolingian Empire remained in place, right? So Naturally, much of the system revolved, even contractually, around the family nucleus of the peasantry. That was the base on which the demansus was usually assigned to, and the contracts were practically made. Many of these contracts were naturally oral, as it was normal in large areas of Europe, especially in the north. So sometimes we don't really know excessively much, and other times we're better documented and we can assess this better. But this was a very spontaneous process at the end of the day. So it developed in different, in large part in a way we can't truly see. And we're fortunate enough that certain areas produced documents relative to local production, and the peasants had to correspond to the lord a certain quota of their products, and they were furthermore obliged to this free labor service that is known later mostly as the corvée, like this basically gratuitous service that they were not paid for, but that the lord could enforce simply because it was the stronger side, or maybe simply because there were also emergential situation for which people had to work anyway. So that the lord would maybe seize the opportunity to say, oh well, that happened once, let's do it again. It becomes a custom, right? And this is interesting because the free labor happened on the Pars Dominica as well. So basically, the lord was exploiting the freemen's, let's say, labor force, in order to strengthen, to improve, to develop its own personal reserve. So that's pretty meaningful. But this always happens when the lord gains the upper hand for some reason, and definitely hard times bring to social stratification, in great part to impoverishment, right? So around the lord, the dominus, there was gravitated this more or less wide group of people that were closely in contact with the lord. So that these were friends. First of all, the relatives, of course, but also friends, protégé, the bodyguards, squires. The scutiferi. Those were brought literally the shield for the lord. And always remember that this is a military aristocracy. So that's why before we were giving so much importance to stables, for example, together with mills and farms, because these were mostly armed retinues on horseback, etc. The lord is called senior, right? So the old man, right? The older in kind of a reverent fashion. Hence seigneurial and other words that are used even modern European languages. And like monsieur is in French is mon seigneur, my lord, my seigneur, right? The Italian signore as well, that is the same. That eventually is used to define the signories in Italy that are something very, very different. They're kind of monarchical city-states monarchs. This is important because it tells you, even at a lexicon level, how the impact that this phase had in European history. And the senior was also a military term, actually. These warrior bands that existed called initially the chieftain, the senior, like the older guy, because this was traditionally, it was like, so in the war bands, usually the leader was the older one. It wasn't just strong, because he had proven his strength when he was young, chiefly when you're hot-headed and intemperate, and then they grew a little older, a little wiser, and that was particularly important, especially when you reach the top. of policy and military. So only later it developed into dominus proper. And it's interesting, this semantic switch, because better, this actual vocabulary switch, because before the guy is the lord, excuse me, the old man, and then it becomes the dominus. Dominus comes from these Latin terms cannot really quite be literally translated, but dominus is also has to do with domus, for example. It was the household, so it's something larger, something even more honorific by certain standards, or at least that indicates another, even kind of structural and not just individual preeminence, right? So these retinues formed the group, this group known as the Comitatus initially, or the Trustes. These terms are also very important to analyze, because Comitatus is, remember the Comitas that we talked about before. It was the grade 0 of Carolingian nobility, let's say, and comes is a Latin word, has to do with this unity of more people together. The Comitatus is also what the Romans called like this warrior bands that were under the same lord. And the term Trustes, that for Germanic speakers is kind of, they understand it's a Germanized Latin term, right? It would be the equivalent of trustees, right? Trustee, actually. And in this case, the retinue of trustees, probably. So the Trustes was this originally bonding, this very, I don't even know how to say, strict bond that existed between the chieftain and the warriors, right? This actually existed also in the Roman world, but it was particularly even in Germanic idea, especially of the war band. And since at this point the military character of this seigneury is essentially revived, because they start becoming really all about war at this point, not really about or primarily at least, because they managed, definitely the lords managed their also economically their world, but they would start increasingly to hire someone else to do it, while they were primarily knights. They were becoming at least. So, remember the Franks had their own antrustiones, for example. They were literally the bodyguard of the Frankish noblemen. Another term that was used was fideles, that means the faithful ones, right? This has to do with the Latin concept of fides, that is also a very strong bond, because it's not just a contract, but it's actually a religious bond. And that has to do with honor, with the sense of respect. It's something that goes beyond even just the human dimension. And remember that at this time, contracts, even transactions, were all done by, even trials were all based on swearing on the Holy Scriptures when making a statement and making an agreement. And also, this was a way for society to regulate what was considered as official, in the absence, especially of a public authority that could certify it or validate it. So even these oral agreements were, these were also public agreements, so that there could be many people who could witness that, and if you broke the pact, theoretically, all the society would have, consider you kind of a lesser man, right? And this is pretty ideal, but the idea is that in the ancient world, in the Indo-European roots of Europe, the assembly of freemen worked like this in the absence of written of scripture. It was all about what the society thought of you, even when especially society could not enforce you something from a central direction because there was no central authority. The idea of making an oath and then infringing it would make you appear like a coward, and therefore like a person was worthless, right? and this is not such a faraway world still from those origins, especially in certain areas of Central Europe. I mean, the progress had, this many of these populations had evolved from a tribal past from a very recent time, right? And part of their social organization was still modeled in part on that, especially in Eastern Francia, etc. And the sources call this group of these retinues in various manners, to tell the truth, but over time there is this term of vassi, from which the same concept of vassal, of course, the same word of vassal comes from, and the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, because which means basically that there are the vassi that obtain a beneficium from the Lord, so that they have to be faithful to, because they have received something from him, and this is actually a Celtic derived word. Actually, it's a Latin word, of course, but it comes from the Celtic etymology that means more or less something like dependent, like what we would call like the employee today. And it's interesting, for example, that in this now Latin and Germanic, predominantly Latin and Germanic world, there is still much of that Celtic substratum that had been what most of Central Europe had been about, fundamentally, that even reappears within Latin itself. It's pretty fascinating. And remember that these terms are gestated, especially in this Vassalatic, in this Frankish world, in fact. So it's not a surprise that Francia is this pretty heavy blend of the Germanic, Celtic, and Latin world, all right, where all these traditions had gotten blended, more mixed than arguably in any other place of Europe at that point. So the Vassi swore fealty to the seigneur, and they received in exchange these beneficia, right? Beneficium is singular, beneficia is plural, and originally this pre-existed the seigneurial system, as we were saying before. I mean, since the time of the Indo-Europeans, like the chieftain would distribute wealth, usually loot, to the war band, and this receiving this that already entailed that those who were under him were essentially obeying them, so partly losing their own freedom and being bonded to them, right? So here it's basically the same thing, but it starts developing on much larger assets. So this beneficia could be they were mostly land at this point, as we have seen, but it could even be precious objects or weaponry, or maybe even money in those rare occasions where it was present, right? So it's very mixed. It really depends on, as long as it's wealth, right? Something that you can quantify. So what is interesting about this is that theoretically is a mutual relation, but at the same time is imbalanced. But it's pretty obvious, right? Which relation is perfectly balanced. But it's this convention, this agreement, this pact, this bond that is the proof that the system needs it, that needs to work on the base of these relations, because otherwise it would be complete chaos. And what is interesting of the seigneurial system is that, paradoxically, Europe gets very slowly, recompacted once again around this seigneurial nucleus, right? And they eventually rise to the top to become great vassals or even kings, etc. And there is no way to say when this thing actually started. Not even, and there is not even need to that. Like, for example, were these pacts voluntary most of the time, so they were imposed. Were they, these communities were under the Lord because they asked for it, or it's because the Lord kind of came to control them against their will? I mean, it's obvious that the reality lays in the middle, actually most of the times, right? Because none of the two is actually so powerful to reach complete, to be completely free about it as an option, right? But it's obvious that over time, and this passes mostly through, wars and devastations, etc., is that the Lord usually gets the upper hand, right? The aristocracy starts to root itself pretty solidly within society and to start to controlling it very, increasingly more, and so that the rest of the society lost their freedoms. As you know, and we discussed this many times, this passage between the 8th, let's say, and the 10th century, let's assume, is this great transition that naturally you can't stretch even, with other boundaries, even before or afterwards. But this progressive loss of freedom of the peasantry and the rise of these aristocracies. So the theory is the passage between the tribe that is kind of, relatively egalitarian. It's always stratified. There are always the aristocratic clans that rule over the other freemen, but they're still fairly balanced. And then you so that everybody's a freeman and there's just an aristocrat that is better at war, is usually appointed by the local assemblies to lead military operations, but at the end of the war everything comes back theoretically as it was before, to the Lord that is at this point not a freeman like all others, but it's something else, it's something more, it's a nobleman, right? So he has this, it has this very high self-esteem, and it considers himself superior to the others. And this peasantry that is not free anymore, basically, because even if theoretically these were free, in practice they're not anymore, right? And a lot has changed in the process of wealth distribution, and this is reflected by several factors, and consider that these terms are also partly relative in the sense that many people claim that before feudal system spread and everything was like in this kind of tribal situation of the Iron Age, it was better to live in the second environment because people were freer, and therefore even quality of life was higher. In fact, people tend to say, well, the average early medieval, say, person in the Latin Germanic world was better off than the average peasant. So the 90+% of the population, already in the 11th century, because it ate more, not what just he was obliged to produce for the Lord. And in fact, it is true, it seems it is true that during the Middle Ages, people ate more fat and proteins. This is very true. Towards the late Middle Ages, most of the peasantry ate just grain-derived food. So it's negative. But at the same time, and this is paradoxical, the absolute wealth of the system increased. This is a big thing. Right, it's really where things get absolutely they stun you in part, because at the same time this produces other classes like the urban centers paradoxically grow to become fairly similar to the feudal elite, at least in their oligarchy. We discussed often about this on Schwerpunkt. So, but the majority doesn't live well, so you have to wait for an industrial revolution to make really a significant change for all these masses to really start to becoming wealthier and to have more rights, because they have more means to fight for them. But for example, also the liberal revolutions of the 18th century, they're about the bourgeoisie, not the masses of the third state, for example. So you understand that there is a lot that also about civilization you can hardly, say, picture as a progress in the proper sense of the world. We have to be grateful that such things happened in the measure in which they allowed us to have what we have more than them. But at the same time, it was a very hard moment, and then people also did a lot of bad things. But at the end of the day, still there is a logic, right? People like to look at these perspectives like saying, that was a bad world because people had very few rights, were oppressed, they lived like in a hell, right? It is true. But at the same time, you should also ask yourself, what was the option there? I mean, and why that system turned into that? And I'm not saying that this is a valid way to justify it, because you should, history is basically all about finding the motivation for this. That is also is already by itself a very difficult thing to do. But I would say that studying the sources of the past really shows you that there was a logic behind that. This is a concept that that every once in a while I come up with that I haven't fully explained actually, but it's very important because it shows you that society, it doesn't matter how harsh it was, but there was still some kind of concrete logic, especially when the situation is not orderly enough. I mean, with the disgregation of political power in post-Carolingian times, you see that, from our picture, this is like the worst thing can happen, right? Because in our modernist view, this is the collapse of a civilization. Everything is garbage, right? Instead, you look at what these guys were doing it from their their own local level, and you realize that they were smart. Then they were doing things, even cooperatively, with this, even lords together with peasant communities, etc. That freaking worked. I mean, this was a system that was in deep trouble, right? Because things were seriously messed up. So this thing didn't die out. This thing actually withstood it and was able to push it forward, and to achieve what we had at the end of the day. So that's not luck, and you can't describe history of humanity just like a continuous oppression and something you have to blame morally. This is something that at the end really worked. And then there are also the dumb people who have to say, well, but it took centuries, it's kind of bad. Yeah, but consider what the technological potential of the time really was. And that's where actually the European timings during the High Middle Ages were pretty damn fast as well. Like, Europe grew in a few centuries after this in a way that, for example, the Byzantine Empire didn't, the Islamic world didn't, even though they're kind of comparable. I mean, they're not radically different measures, but Europe, especially Central Europe, these areas were pretty backwards. I mean, since the ancient world, these were some of the outskirts of civilization. These things came back to grow powerfully, and that's not something you can ignore in the equation. Also because this system managed to take over, right? And and it's complicated to picture. For example, I'm one of those people who believe that the Ottoman Empire at the end of the day was kind of a more of a sort of, was very Western in nature in some ways. After all, it was born on the Bosphorus. It's basically almost Europe, and most of the Ottoman Empire actually developed more in Europe first, then eventually expanding to Asia. The larger conquests at the beginning were in Thrace, in the Balkans, rather than from the starting point of Asia Minor, of Anatolia. But aside from this, what I'm trying to say is that eventually Europe developed in a way, but even in terms of civilization, if you take Western historiography, I mean, even when we talk about history, we don't have to assume, for example, in places like China or India or whatever, people really recorded history in the same way that Europeans were doing. Of course, I'm not saying this is medieval merit. It's obvious that the Greeks had freaking lot to do with this. They spread far and wide this idea of being able to abstract in order to picture things for what they are, not for what they're meant to be. It's a very complex process, and therefore, even the way the Europeans told history, you realize that there is a clarity into that. That I absolutely don't want to say that the other systems were bad or inferior at all. I believe that actually Europeans grew a lot, also thanks to relation with those populations over there. But when you have a system that is able to draw so much from those other ones, and to make it work and to rise at that level, but you start saying this thing has really something that whatever it was, or wherever you want to define, it really worked. And maybe we will go more in depth into this. It's fascinating because there is an enormous historiographical debate about this, and it turns out, even from a strictly economical point of view, recently a university attended a conference that it was about, basically it was about economy. It was talking exactly about this. I mean that, first of all, Westerners, for obvious reasons, studied a lot about themselves, chiefly because we were able, with our development, to kind of preserve more, and also because we know better our sources than someone else's. But for example, looking at Ottoman economy, etc., that's something also relatively more far. There are, for obvious reasons, other certain nationalities that are studying this more, like Balkanic countries that obviously were partly framed into that system, and they're closer even to, Turkish historiography and what that's about. And we see that those historiographies are still, there's still more to discover, because, they produced less up to now, but from what we can see today, you understand, for example, that Western Europe had this ability of expansion capability, that is different from growth proper. I mean, also other systems grew, but they didn't necessarily expand. This is a radical difference, because it turns that out into systems that, like China. China was, no doubt, up to the 18th century, the largest power in the world. I mean, I don't say the largest, but we're not talking about dimensions, but it was the biggest power in the world. But it didn't make it. Like in 1 century, the Europeans were eating it alive. And you wonder why. Well, that has partly to do with this, is that, and I'm convinced that much of these roots were set within the Middle Ages, because if in the Middle Ages Europe had been controlled by a unique empire, probably it would have not produced modern Europe. I mean, what we think modern Europe is really about. And in my opinion, it's partly due to this compartmentalization of resources. This idea that you can't even save resources when an area of Europe is eaten, for example, with the Ottoman advance, right? The whole Balkans are conquered. Hungary is conquered. The Turks start pushing further, and there was, for example, a shift of capitals. Sometimes telling the truth, there were Western capitals also fleeing to the Ottoman Empire. This is something a few consider. Were a lot of Jewish, but also of same Christian capitals fleeing to Constantinople. It was a hell of a center, even under Ottoman Empire. It made it a great city once again. But guess how it ended? And by the way, also this is tricky, because telling you the truth, I don't really like this idea that, because it's a deterministic idea. I'm not saying that Europe had necessarily to reach what it did in the modern age, because there was no other option. like, take a giant like the Ottoman Empire. I mean, the Ottoman Empire is thought as this declining thing. It was, that all the worst prejudices that we can have from the West, but this was a huge empire. It had basically 3 constantly open fronts in the Mediterranean, in the Balkans, and in Mesopotamia. This is something that weighs on a system. And the Ottoman Empire had its chance of modernization, chiefly also looking upon the West for doing that, because the models, but in the 18th century that failed, definitely. The ulama made it fail. But this is another story now. It has nothing to do with the seigneurial system, but just for saying that lots of these trends and of dynamics actually stem from the great reorganization of Europe in these times, in seigneurial times, right? And the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system was dramatically influent for European civilization. It's something we're not prone to recall, because we feel somehow that only for being a medieval thing it's kind of didn't leave anything good, right? It was backwards because it wasn't Roman, it wasn't modern, right? Don't get me wrong, I love the Romans, as you know, and modern age as well, but I'm simply saying that we should give way more credit to the Middle Ages, and we do, especially if you're an expert about this, like, the importance, but sometimes there is so much, and written historiographically speaking, in so much detail, and people tendentially on average don't even care about history in the first place, that they don't even have the essentials. They're pretty disoriented, that at the end of the day you can write much in the academy, but really popular culture not receiving the message, right? So that's also why I digress so much, because when I feel of something, if not interesting, at least thought-provoking, I think I tell you to reflect on it. I think it's part of what this channel is about. So what else can we say about the seigneurial system that we haven't said yet? And so we could stress for the importance that the 8th century had in the process, because what I failed up to now, but what I tried to make you picture here is that but I'm too biased towards the Franks not to point them out that they were the major cause of this process, but let's say that they accelerated it rapidly, and this started since the 8th century, right? So, but this thing already existed before. This is important to remember. There is, I made a video here, I made so many videos now that I can't even remember the names, but I don't remember the term actually, where going to Carolingian Europe you should find a lot of stuff about the origins of the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system and something like that in the Frankish world. And we already addressed the geographical dimension of the spread of the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system during the Carolingian times, and and yet we have to stress that this differentiation between the Pars Massarica and the Pars Dominica was basically standing since Roman times, at least since the late Roman times. This is something you can find since the initial Roman latifundia. It's the same concept, right? In late Roman times, basically the Roman aristocracy kind of fled the cities to restart from the countryside, very approximately, but still it had always been about the countryside. The Roman villa, typically speaking, even Republican times, let's assume, was that, and the Romans were terribly in love with the countryside, were landlubbers fundamentally in the day. It was all about this rural dimension, the agricultural dimension, right? And this idea that it's even a model of life at the end of the day. So it was something deeply rooted into, especially in sedentary Europe, right? And this organization with the colonists that have to work for paying either in money or in nature or in a mixed way, the Lord, the Dominus, and this repartition of the land in the patronal reserve and in the various land plots already existed before, right? What the Carolingians do is that they reformulate it in different ways. The part of the reason why it also gains so much importance in general is in fact the decline of urban activities in part, also the shortage in the availability of slaves. This is important. That's why I was talking about before, for example, the kind of the debatable differences between slaves and serfs at this point, because it's there was slavery proper. Even during Charlemagne's campaign, you realize, I don't know, when he conquered the other kingdom, he deported slaves fundamentally, also because they were pagans, by the way. But what appears here is really more like the serf, right? And one of the reasons is that there weren't so many people around. It was not like in the early Roman Empire, where every once in a while there was a new conquest and hundreds of thousands of slaves pouring into the market, etc. Even Carolingian campaigns were that they replicated in part something like that, but not in the same numbers of the empire. So here it's not properly a system based on slavery, but on a much more cooperative relation between the lords of the local communities. That is still based on definitely exploitation and all, but it's still pretty different. And also manpower has acquired a much greater importance, and in the individual life in itself. Christianity also helped. This was a fully Christian empire as well, and therefore the idea is that there shouldn't be slaves among Christians, under a Christian lord especially. So that's something that partly contributed even to the dynamism of this system, and to remain partly, even there is an idea of entrepreneuriality in this that is important. Like as long as you have a slavery in the truest sense of the word, basically you don't care, for example, to innovate, because you have this cheap labor force about which you don't give a damn, because hey, they're slaves, and they and there is no autonomous improvement. The fact that these nuclei of serfs were installed into the plots, it was still part of freedom into it that made this kind of better. I mean, they had a sense, they had a purpose, right? It was not just surviving like slaves have to do, unfortunately for them most of the time. But they have some propositive nature, and I must say that both the relics of public authority and the church were pushing to support the system, like to say, okay, that there has to be a productive cooperation, right? That there is a Christian society that has to remain kind of healthy within itself. I made several videos about this. Consider that some of the most important ecclesiastical figures of this time naturally were drawn from the same aristocracy, so also they were trying partly to embellish the story. But this is really how it worked at the end of the day. So there had to be a functionality. And I made that video recently on the tripartite order of medieval society, and observing how, yeah, in part is ideal, but in part is also kind of true, right? So history is often, actually most of the time, is always like this. You can't, especially something that happened so many times, so many years ago, you can't really tell how it really was at the end of the day. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on again. So this society produced civilization, even at a cultural level, right? Even the existence of an empire, the idea that there still was a hierarchy out there, there had to be an order, and that this hierarchy, doesn't matter how weakened, actually survived over time, is pretty remarkable. As much as it's remarkable that the same seigneurial system produced a great part of order when these lordships were sufficiently expanded and consolidated, with all the casualties that they entailed, right, in the process, including individual freedom, but still producing something else as well, like cities. Urban classes were very, very different from the seigneurial mindset that even put seigneurial economy in crisis, but partly blended with it as well. So something that is never stable. The society always changes. There is no point of arrival. Everything moves constantly. So here, the evaluation of working force is important. In a place, in a time in which there was a scarce wealth, scarce population, resources were limited, human life is paradoxically evaluated more because it's more precious. It can produce more. It can help other people, right? And so this self-sustenance of certain types of serfs actually makes them resemble also kind of relatively autonomous people. For example, there were the prebendari and the casati, that are these two categories that basically are like families that have just to pay a canon to lord to work on that land, and ultimately they can do whatever they want with the land, on the land, let's say better. Even the casati ones that received this possibility of settling there and living and having, and the lords were incentivizing this. So even the lords it wasn't really convenient for them to have this draconian measures imposed on the peasantry, because much of the peasantry, never forget this, could still move under someone else, some other lord. And since there was a dreadful competition between lords, naturally there was even an economical competition of which contract was more advantageous and could attract more working force, right? This world that is dominated, as you understand, is a mostly, almost completely rural environment, has also other forms of economical profit. There is not just the agricultural exploitation, there is also the uncultivated land. That is that group of woods, of meadows, of swamps, the spontaneous resources of which, starting from the one provided by hunting and fishing, were integrated in actually a very significant manner into the alimentary reserve, right? Woods were dramatically important. Lakes, woods were, if you wanted to breed pigs, they had to send them, eating their nuts and other stuff. They're dramatically important for the economy. And that's why the woods were usually they start becoming kind of a royal domain even when the monarchy spreads, because they're dramatically profitable. And in fact, you can see that the spread of the seigneury, of the seigneurial system, goes in parallel with the subtraction of these spaces to the freemen. They're seized by the lords, and believe me, they could defend them really pretty harshly. I remember, I think it was actually in 12th century Germany, there was a band of raiders that visited regularly the woods of one nobleman because they went there stealing, wood, food, animals, etc. And this lord basically sent them a letter telling them, if you don't get the hell out of there, which is my wood, this is private domain, right? You understand the very deep private perception of this possession. I will have you all hanged onto those trees, and these guys get the hell out of there, because at that point the Lord could do it, and they exercise justice on this land with arms, and those were not times you could mess around with noblemen, because they would be pretty much in trouble. So so as you can imagine, everything, the various cortes were dramatically different in depending on which they were. They were all unique, right? And even the internal land was used in different ways. There is naturally even certain areas that have to remain for certain times as fallow land. Others are used as pastures. There are the compasqua, for example, that are basically these shared pastures. That is something that actually dates back to very, very long time before, like since the Bronze Age, really. Was typical in Europe, having this communities that instead of fighting over this pastures, they decide to exploit it together, and this is pretty frequent somewhere else. There is a kind of even a democratic idea behind it, obviously in the contextualizing in the time, not our sense of democracy, but the idea that there can be even a pacific composition of the problems. This is something you find in seigneurial Europe. That is, you say, well, but these guys were all about war. They were all knights. They were developing as military professionals. Well, yes, but policy is works like that too. We know it perfectly. There is not just violence. You shouldn't conceive another prejudice that actually didn't battle, because I rarely thought about it now on Schwerpunkt, is this idea that medieval society was intrinsically brutal. I mean, compared to other ages. I mean, I was born in the 20th century, and we all know what happened in the 20th century. Take Nazism, take communism. It's really not very happy things. Like, actually, probably the greatest, most shameful things humans have ever done in the whole history of mankind. How can you say medieval times were more brutal than Roman times, or than modern age, or contemporary? How can you say that? Because there is this sort of macho attitude towards the Middle Ages. They are cool, yeah, because they're knights with swords and maces and all. But it was very much like other times in history, really. And before that, civilization progresses only through intelligence, not through iron fist. I mean, the iron fist is when you have wall against wall, and it doesn't work otherwise. But most of the time, people tend to negotiate, right? And that's civilization. And that happens as well. Even if this is objectively a very highly militarized society, but it's not so, particularly more brutal than other times, really. Obviously, for our own standards, of course, we would have pretty serious problems to live in a society like that. But that's what society has been literally for forever, up to a few centuries ago, right? And I'm sorry, but I'm sorry for culturalist people, but violence doesn't decrease with civilization. It's just an illusion. At least potential capabilities actually increase. And this is dramatic. And we are at peace now simply because we have nuclear weapons and nobody has the political interest to wipe out the whole world. Hence, we don't destroy each other, or at least we do it in in a much smaller scale, right? So that's also the power of deterrence at the end of the day. These lordships didn't require a lot of bloodbath to be maintained, actually, but it was enough to understand who was in charge and then playing within the system accordingly. And yet still, yes, of course, was a lot of violence, was a lot of clash, a lot of infighting, but there is still reason in some ways that saves that's why wisdom was so important, even in the war bands, right? That's where seigneur comes from as a concept. So it gives name to the seigneurial system. It's probably meaningful, as you understand. So if you take the Pars Dominica and the Massarica one, these weren't even to be considered to actually pretty distincted blocks. Sometimes were fragmented, as we've seen, but also integrated the one on the other. Because when you look at this stuff, you don't have the seigneuries, you don't have to think about it as only as a territorial thing. I mean, you could have a seigneury even on just, I don't know, some tolls that you could exact from one mill somewhere, right? The rights over, I don't know, river crossings, hunting or fishing licenses, stuff could be sold and bought, and everything was dramatically complex. There could be lords that had a conjuncted right over a particular place. Yeah, there were shared lordships, definitely. So it's not strictly territorial. It's also strictly about income, and by the way, this system was a really juridical nightmare, legal nightmare, excuse me, because these lordships sometimes were so big that they generated further lordships to be controlled. That's why you have several, a sort of hierarchy in because not because there is a standard level of titles, etc., but you have a chain of dependency that sometimes gets reversed because maybe one part of the seigneury is wiped out and the remnants kind of start to become a seigneury on their own. So it's that messed up, but that produces wealth. I mean, it produces know-how, intelligence, because these people have to cope with new problems that before were not conceived. People start writing more because they have to take into account the complexity of this system in order to regulate it. There is a civilization revolving around this that naturally is fueled by a general economical revival that, albeit weak generally, but it still exists. And these societies do change. They do have a different. They have a story, right? They have an evolution in some way, transformation for sure, but also towards something kind of better, right? And this is important. I think we got desensitized to the importance of rule, of solid rule. The primary reasons why these seigneuries were born were to defend yourself from violence. This is meaningful, right? You need this organization. It's not born just because of structural mechanic reasons. There is a concerted effort for making things better. It's part of human nature. Fortunately, because otherwise we are capable of doing kind of the worst things, but we are able to choose, and turns out, at least up to now, we kind of improved. And by the way, the complexity of the lordship triggers the rise of specializations in the techniques and forms of production. These lordships were not only about agricultural production, as we have seen. There is increased specialized work that is production that is integrated. There are artisan workshops, ovens, olive presses, canteens, etc., that demonstrated actually the market required this stuff, that there were people who were able to buy this now. And who were these people? Well, they were probably most of the times the same aristocracy. The aristocracies, as we were saying before, reinvested everything, but part of this reinvestment was really and functionally about having a more expansive lifestyle, because that was very important from a political point of view, to impress, to invest in this sense into ideology, if you want, to be up to the to the social status rank standards. These guys always hoped the king, for example, would appoint them with sort of, many of the lordships were legitimized by the monarchy to form this bondage, so they had even to be presentable in some. It may sound weird, but it's really so. Luxury is not properly leisure only. It's also a way to, and there are people who work for producing that luxury, right? So people were kind of rewarded with that. So this is what contributes to expand, and also will produce the great chivalric epics, the old great, what we idealize the most, the Middle Ages, like, all this idea, tales of knights and dames and tournaments and courtly love and all this stuff. Naturally, reality was much more brutal than that, but it's still civilization that made us grow intellectually, made us growing more sensitive, more attentive to even to human dignity, to lots of things. This is really how it's born. And at the same time, there is also progress occurring together with the expansion of seigneurial land domains. Like, because the greater this domination is, the more it's difficult to manage. So, as we have seen before, this partly happened to this further decentralization, but it was still a way of controlling this. When you think about the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, yes, it was decentralized in the sense that it's opposed to the modern way we think a state is, but actually this thing was still held together. So do not fall into the trick of those who tell you, everything was decentralized, it was impossible to control anything. Because no, these systems were born exactly because you could control better things. And the larger seigneuries invested in certain uniformations of production that stemmed from an obvious necessity for rationalization, that saved further resources, and naturally also for an economical goal. Now, this uniformation actually passed through the oblation, let's say, to the work performances chiefly. The corvée of peasants, dependently whether they were freemen or serfs, started to be more uniformed, to be exacted more efficiently, to be issued in a more functional and rational way. So this put in motion a much more sophisticated way of controlling resources. What I was telling you about before, that if you had left in the hand of free peasantry that was scattered here and there without any common organization, it would have produced probably a weaker system at the end of the day. So that maybe the individual would have been freer, but at the same time the system would have been weaker. So this is also paradoxical and very thought-provoking and fascinating, and it's actually how it happened. So this system allowed basically to dispose at the top of society of increasing amount of wealth that could be invested and reinvested in a system that was still dramatically fragmented at an upper level, but that in this sense was also growing once again in terms of competitiveness, right? So that this pushed for further improvement, further refinement, and that's really what you want. So, what do we know about the lifestyle of people? I mean, do we really know about how people lived at the time? We're really not so much. We have a very few documents that tell us about the rural life of these centuries, but the few that we can see from it is definitely a conservative reality made up by freemen or servile peasants, together with their families that worked the field, sometimes with the help of an ox or a horse, right? The children usually, I mean, women were engaged into work. They worked pretty damn hard. Not just in this context, also later. Children were entrusted with the custody of animals, of the low court animals like goats, sheep, pigs, that were, as you know, especially pigs, very, 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 very important for early medieval economy, especially. I mean, pigs' guardians had a higher price than the average freeman. So in the Romano-Germanic laws, so that tells you a lot actually. And the economy, as we were saying before, is basically based on autonomy, alimentary self-sufficiency largely, that is integrated with hunting or fishing, or even with the gathering of spontaneous fruits from the woods or the uncultivated areas. So there were these small communities, as you understand, in a largely rural environment. And remember that even in those cities in those regions of Europe where there were more cities, etc., it was still obviously about rural environment most of the times. So there are massive differences from areas of Europe that I always recall, in the sense that, when we talk about the forests chiefly, but the broader rural dimension is pretty evident in the average European reality. And the surplus was pretty modest. The productive exceedances were usually sold in the market, so this generated some wealth in process. And there was definitely also this exchange between different producers that were practiced, so that this stuff was not really sold to anyone on the market, but really, there were relations of interdependence between several communities that exchanged goods with barter and kind of, integrating with this system what they individually lacked, forming bonds and making ideas circulate and stuff. So this shows pretty evidently that the seigneurial system was absolutely not incompatible with a commercial regime, right? And it could work pretty well, and that's where the revival of European economy really started from. Okay, so I think for today it's enough. Oh my god, 2 hours and 20 about this. Okay, and I always like to talk about this the seigneurial system proper, because it's overlooked, and instead it's cool, because it was really the reality that Europe came from. I mean, these were our ancestors basically. So it's, I mean, if you have European origins, we all passed through that in the past, our ancestors did. So it's meaningful because after all, it's not that up to 1 century ago things were so radically different. There were still a lot of people living more in the countryside than in the cities, definitely. 1 century ago things were pretty different from the Middle Ages, but you start looking at 200 years ago, 300 years ago, well, not so much really. So it's interesting because to think about these times, because it's as if they weren't actually that far, culturally speaking, from us than what they are temporally. And entering in the mindset of these realities is probably a better way to frame our own existence into history. I mean, to realize where we come from and what humans usually do when they are in those conditions, and stopping having this prejudice towards, that think that we are better now. Because I personally don't think we are better now. And not because I want to say that, these were tough, cool people. That simply they had to be pretty damn smart and capable. Something that we are not, seemingly, anymore. We are differently. We are more theoretically oriented. We are capable of more abstraction, but really we don't commit ourselves as those guys did. And if they had seen the condition in which we live today, and they would have probably said, but what are you waiting for? Go out there, work, produce, do something with your life, right? So this can really spur you even to be perhaps a better person, to think about the deprivations people had back in the day, and how lucky and disgustingly advantaged we are for having, for what they did actually, and we even dare to say that that we don't care, or that they were worse than us. It's not really like that. We are not better than them. Okay, so for now I think it's enough, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.